working, yeah. Guys, thank you so much for coming to this rather niche subject, the talk of this. The title is Deconstructing the Academic Journey of Doctoral Scholarship as an LGBTQ Student. Is it time for queering of academic literacies? My name is Mickey, if I don't know you, but most of my colleagues are in here, so I know most of you. Full disclosure, the journey was my one, yeah. So in this talk, I'm reflecting on an autoethnography I did during my doctoral studies. Do I think it's time for queer of academic literacies? Like, probably, yes. So I'm going to give all of that away. This has been one of the worst things I ever did, this project, and I wish I never did it because it was so hard. And it was hard in the way that when you have data, when you can just present it, it's quite straightforward. But when you're unpicking things about yourself, my God, that's really, really hard. So it's really arduous. So this is going to be a book chapter, which will be in at the end of the month. I'll be so glad to see the back of it for a while. And I'll probably come back and then do something again and just go over it all again. So just to give an introduction, and I think the introduction to this is the really hard bit of trying to frame something. So I kind of feel like if I can get through the introduction, then I'll probably be okay. But what I'm trying to do in this project is I talk about some things which are quite complicated. It's a lot to do with the self and how that intersects with doctoral study. So I'm being very tentative as well about what I'm saying. So I'm tentatively posing questions about how some LGBTQ students may experience their scholarly writing within a mainstream. And the mainstream is really important. So I'm not thinking about scholars who go into like a particular small group where they would fit in easily, but actually to a mainstream where they might disrupt that mainstream or not be able to fit into it. And then thinking, like, what may this mean for academic literacies? Is there something that we're not seeing here? What are the experiences of particularly the Q and the queer students amongst the LGBTQ? So to try to get a handle on where I'm coming from with this, I'm really looking at the Q in the LGBTQ. I think we need to go back in time a little bit and think about a kind of age-old debate within LGBTQ communities. But of course, there's no one community, as with any community. There's a lot of communities in amongst them. And there's been a big fault line, to my mind, through those communities between assimilation and liberation. Yeah? So, for instance, if we look back in time and take an example, and that example is equal marriage, we actually kind of take for granted now that we still push for equal marriage. But actually at the very beginning of that journey, it was quite a debate about whether or not we should do that, because ultimately something like equal marriage is trying to assimilate into mainstream. Because if we assimilate into mainstream, we can have some capital which we can then get a return on. So for instance, if I marry someone of the same sex, I can be recognized by straight people as having an authentic relationship. Yeah? I can then I can will something and have inheritance rights, and makes things like adoption potentially easier. So if I join the mainstream, my life will be easier. Yeah? However, should we do that? And that's the debate back a long time ago. Should we do that? Because actually, no offense to people who are married, but it's an unsuccessful institution in lots of ways. It's divorce rate not like 42%. A whole ton of shit goes down. Yeah. Oh, sorry, take that word back. A whole ton of stuff goes down in marriages. And do we want to replicate that? Should we replicate that? Because actually, if we do, we're conforming to a heteronormative society. And when we conform to that, we lose authenticity or become homonormative. Now, if someone wishes to live a homonormative life and segue into the mainstream, fantastic, go for it. because life is easier if you can join a mainstream. But what if you don't want to do that? And what if by not joining it, what are the consequences for you? Because going back to the original debate, before the push for equal marriage, was that actually the mainstream should be queered, and we should be changing the mainstream by disrupting it and changing the way that it is, so that we can introduce different kinds of relationships into it and have them authenticated as well. So, is it okay to sacrifice authenticity to be recognized by a mainstream, or should we try to hang on to the authenticity? And I actually think that authenticity is becoming a little bit of a trope in LGBTQ stuff. And sometimes when you're watching things, I don't know, like on Netflix, you'll hear someone saying, you know, oh, I'm just like living my authentic life and all of this. And we're getting a little bit tropey, but I actually think it is really important. And I think from this project, I really learned something about myself, that I'm actually really queer in here, which I didn't realize. I don't think I particularly present like that. But if we have lots of intersections in our life, I'm not going to go into it because it's self-indulgent. I'll just give you a little snapshot. Terribly self-indulgent. I grew up in rural Scotland in the 90s. It was massively homophobic and masculine, just horrendous. So I obviously constructed my personality and my outward appearance in a particular way to survive that. But in here, I've actually remained quite queer. I didn't realize that until I did this project, that actually how I see things are very queer, that I don't want to conform to a mainstream. I don't want to lose authenticity, and that really helped me to understand my doctoral studies. Because if we think about those, and another reason why I decided to share this in this analysis is that common ground for queerness is its collective resistance to various forms of normativity and institutional control. So I thought, hang on, if I feel like this, then I can't be the only one. Even though I'm coming from a very tiny place of my own experience, I can't be the only one that feels like that. And of course, institutions are norm providing, and they are powerful. And what happens if you don't conform within them? So if we think about all of this resistance and power, through your formative years, what dispositions are constructed for you if in the world you're always resisting power? You're in that dynamic. And to what extent do you begin to recognize yourself as someone who resists power, and how you find value in what you do? If I'm not resisting, what the hell am I doing? Yeah, I'm just conforming. So that's it. That's all I was grappling with in this, yeah? All that kind of heavy stuff. So this is the worst time to have this session, like a Friday, end of the conference, yeah? But is it reinforcing authenticity in some way? So, within all of that complicated stuff about trying to unpack all of this, the one thing that I do know is that where I'm looking at this is a particular flashpoint, and it's where these LGBTQ dispositions intersect with doctoral studies and research writing, because it's also a formative process where you begin to understand who you are as an academic and who you will be as a writer, and where that will allow you to go. So it's like a fluid formative journey where you can ask yourself, or you ask yourself questions like, who am I in this text? With what authority and freedom do I speak? And it raises, I think, bigger questions such as, with what authority and freedom can queer scholars speak? In what ways are we allowed to, or in what ways are we allowed to know, and what ways are we allowed to write? Saying all of this, going back to what I just said, I wish I was standing on the shoulders of giants, but I'm just clearly not. I feel like I'm standing on the head of a pin and it's all very precarious because like I'm critically reflecting on a previous autoethnography to kind of look again at it. So I realize the limitations of this and I'm coming from this very particular place. The other thing I've learned from this is that when you're trying to write a reflective analysis about something like this, it's so bloody hard because everything is shifting all the time. Because actually when we analyze a past self, our interpretations of that keep changing all the time. And actually we begin to understand our present self differently. So we're learning in here and we're looking at a past and both are shifting at the same time. However, when we go to write it down, it's locked in a past state. So there's this shifting reality. So this what will be a book chapter has been rewritten so many times like you wouldn't imagine the torment of all of it. It's been so many times I've written it thinking, yes, I read it back, no, that's changed. No, that's wrong. Oh, that's wrong. Oh, that's wrong as well. Oh, that's wrong too. And I have to rewrite the whole thing. So it's this kind of shifting realities. However, from this, I managed to draw out 4 wider categories of what I believe could inform a framework for thinking about academic literacies through a queer lens. And this is positionality, power, authenticity in writing, and choices. Okay, I'm not going to come back to them in a little bit. So I'm so happy that introduction is over. So literature. For what I'm trying to look at, there's basically nothing much to find. I want to know about how queer scholars or queer people who are scholars are experiencing their literacy journey, ultimately, and there's not very much about that. One thing I did find in the literature, which I found really helpful, was, in a way, parallel experiences. So there have been some instances in literature where LGBTQ people have clearly been obliged to navigate difficult situations. And I felt like when I did my doctoral studies that's what happened to me. I'm like, this is a difficult situation, it's complex, I need to understand it more. So I did an autoethnography to help me understand it. And you can find these in the literature. Now, I don't understand some of these experiences. Like the first one is about gendered spaces by a trans person. Like, I'm a cisgendered man, I don't understand that experience, yeah? Another one is about sexuality, race, and religion. I'm clearly a white man, and I am not part of an organized religion. Coming out in sport, like, hey, I love sport, but I'm not in any way professional or semi-professional. But there's something kind of parallel about these experiences, even though I don't understand them specifically, that helped me to write this book chapter. Because in each of them, they demonstrate people who are trying to understand something, interpret things amongst shifting realities. And actually, you know what? After reading it, I'm glad that people did it, and I'm glad it's in the literature because it gives a window into a particular experience. This is the last of the heavy stuff. To help me understand this, I put together a theoretical framework which I thought would be helpful in understanding what was happening to do the analysis. And I took 3 wider positions. The first position I took was that academic writing is a product of the self and is fundamentally social in nature. Yeah? That self is never fixed. It's indeterminate. We don't actually understand ourself as much as we think we do, and that self is always changing. And that self exists within institutional constructs. The second was that actually, when we submit a piece of writing, or we do a piece of writing, it's the product of what Ursula Wingate says is the product of a series of complex literacy activities. So there's a whole ton of complex stuff going on, and then we finally get to the end where we submit something. So my question is, for queer people, what is happening on that journey? What is happening along that series of complex literacy activities? What's going on? And that's what we don't know. When we submit our piece of writing, it involves interest, epistemology, and power relationships. The third standpoint I took was that as we go along a journey for doctoral studies, when we begin to become the academic that we are, we learn that there are rules to a game in that I can't say Bourdieu properly, it's because I'm like from a working class background and I feel pretentious, Bourdieu, so I'm just going to skip past that, although I love the work. But we learn the rules of the game as we go, and we gain a capital. And it's whether or not we can exchange that capital for something. It's going back to that idea of the mainstream and homonormativity. So to spend my capital, it has to be recognized by a heteronormative mainstream. But so it's the same with academic writing. How I write has a capital, and how is that recognized? How can that be exchanged? Because in academia, written work is the most valuable capital, and it's exchanged for status through publications. So if I was going to go and do some big quantitative piece of work, I could maybe get it in a big journal, but who the hell wants to read this? You know what I mean? So it has a lower capital and for a mainstream, maybe not for my audience right now. Okay, so to get the data for this analysis, I deconstructed my past autoethnography, which is my thesis. I'm not going through that, all right? That'd be like way too much time and self-indulgent again. So I deconstructed it and then reconstructed it to understand it through the eyes of the person I am now, or I was when I did it, which are different people. They were changing all the time. To do this, of course, I did this in a really weird way, and I took a constructive grounded theory approach, not claiming to have made a constructivist grounded theory, but I took an approach and I deconstructed the autoethnography. So you have written text, you have lines of text. I made a code for each line, and I took the codes and then I reorganized them to break the data up, to look at it again. Then I focused the codes in like a mind mapping way to bring them together and think about what would subsume that, to break it up, fragment it, and then build it back together, up and up and up like this, and by subsuming codes and subsuming codes. From that, I formed the categories. That was the 4 categories I had earlier. So these categories then provided a structure to write reflectively with the application of the theoretical framework. Yeah? You're still with me? Yeah? So that was what I did. I then wrote it and rewrote it several times, like I described, in an arduous process of torture, again and again and again, till I got to a product which I felt vaguely happy with for a short period of time. That's why deadlines are great, otherwise you just keep like writing it. So, what did I find? And here's the 4 categories. I think this presentation is really short. I don't know how it ended up being quite short. Maybe it won't be as short as I thought. So I have 4 tentative categories for a queering of academic literacies. And the first one is about positionality, being that investigating positionality as a student or a mentor is necessary before a literacies journey begins. So I found that when I started my journey of doctoral studies, I had to interrupt it halfway through to think, what the hell is going on here? Why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing? Why am I having trouble with certain aspects of this? And I thought that from this analysis, I thought that actually positioning the self and mapping out a terrain to position oneself as a queer scholar is actually like a really necessary place to start. Thank you. Doing this is not unusual, and we can find it in the literature that auto-ethnographic investigation into academic literature practices has been done before, so this is nothing new. The second thing of this second part of this category is that considering the norms of the traditional university is important. Because, and we all know it because we're all in EAP, but there are still assumptions that every student arrives fully equipped and prepared with all the necessary skills that they have to navigate their journey through academia. That's a given. So we need to, as queer scholars, think about the tradition and think that we're actually, like, I love this quote from Suarez down there, which we're actually in a post-traditional era. So rather than everyone's a non-traditional student these days almost, but it seems ridiculous that everyone's a non. So we're in a post-traditional era. But we need to consider the traditions. The last part of it is that we need to have a consideration of power and potentially our lack of power as queer scholars. So thinking, where am I positioned as a student in this institution with the relationship with my supervisor? Because I think that power, going to my next point, is particularly important. So the second category I have is about awareness raising of power relationships. Whether we like it or not, supervisors and examiners are gatekeepers, and they can allow or disallow any progress on our doctoral journey. They hold a lot of power over us. So I think that a consideration of power and awareness raising of this is really necessary for queer scholars. And we know this from many other contexts in around EAP, where language users experience power traditions, again, from traditional norms. And we've talked about things like that in this conference already, such as native speakerism. So we can see this in global Englishes and critical EAP. However, there is little to no debate on academic literacies about the experience of queer students. How do queer students experience power? Power is massive if you are not part of a mainstream. It's a massive thing, but it's not talked about at all. In what ways are queer students or scholars allowed to communicate knowing through their writing? To what extent can or should queer authenticity be sacrificed to access power? Third category was protecting authenticity and voice. I think that actually having a voice as an LGBTQ person is particularly important to successfully becoming a writer. And I believe actually in my life I have had to fight a lot to have an authentic voice, so therefore being able to continue this in doctoral studies is particularly important. We know from the literature that voice is essential to academic discourse and successful academic writing. It's particularly important at doctoral level because you have to write your own theory. You have to be an authority. But how can you be an authority if you feel like you can't genuinely be yourself, or you don't have your authentic voice? However, I also think that the concept of authenticity needs to be made clear, because if we look down at this quote here, after coming up with this category of authenticity, I looked it up in the literature. I read this utterly bizarre statement from Nelson and Castello, who suggest that in academic discourse practices, writers are generally expected to conform to certain norms in order to more likely be seen as having a voice that is authentic for the practices in which they engage. I do not understand how you can conform and be authentic. I just do not understand how that is possible. So I think that we actually need to reconceptualize some of this. Finally, last category in here is about recognizing queer choices. So to join the mainstream and experience straightforwardness, or to resist it and experience struggle, is an age-old queer experience. And actually, when you enter into an institution and you want it to recognize your work, you face that same choice again. Can I write this and have it accepted and keep its authenticity? If I don't keep its authenticity, will it still have value for me? If I conform to a mainstream, does what I've written feel completely empty? And whether or not in the end you want to conform to that mainstream, I think you have the right as a queer scholar to be told about this and to think about this, and this to be part of your literacies journey, rather than it just confronting you from nowhere. Bernini talks about queer scholars in academies and says that they may occupy vulnerable positions in an academy, and that queer theories cannot have a peaceful relationship with institutions in general. Like, maybe it's not possible as a queer scholar that you can have any kind of peaceful relationship with an institution, but I think academic literacies could help us to navigate that difficult situation before we start it. The literature also tells us that there are many others who face choices similar to LGBTQ students and scholars between authenticity of the self and mainstreaming. For instance, Kanagaraja talks about it, about absorbing the dominant culture. Wingate talks about how it may come at a cost as identity changes are enforced by institutional requirements. Students have no choice but to do this to avoid failure. So, do you want to be authentic, or do you want to fail? Which one do you want? However, there is no discussion of this in the literature for me in terms of LGBTQ students. So, to conclude that, I don't know if I did a very good job of really explaining it. This analysis is just a starting point for something. I'm starting from this very small place which has serious limitations, but I do think that sharing it can help to impact a mainstream. Future directions for it, well, I'd like to step up a little bit from the small place that I'm in and try to build up something from the ground up. So how do queer scholars experience their academic literacies journeys? I actually don't know, other than my own one. So it would be good to know more. And a much better version of this presentation will go into a chapter which will be called Novice LGBTQ+ Scholars, Practices in Writing for Scholarly Publication. Oh my goodness me, that's references. And any questions, yeah.